Imagine waking up in ancient Rome, not as a senator or gladiator, but as one of the millions of slaves who powered the empire. Your body isn't yours, it's property. Your choices aren't yours. They're dictated by a master who could sell your children or beat you without consequence. This wasn't the exception. It was the brutal norm for nearly a third of Rome's population. Today, we're uncovering the hidden engine of the empire, the lives of those who built it in chains, the silent majority in the heart of Rome, daily life unfolded in crowded streets, noisy marketplaces, and towering apartment blocks. But hidden behind the city's energy was a reality that shaped everything. Enslaved people made up a significant share of the urban population, perhaps 30 to 50% in some districts. Rome was not just a city of citizens and senators. It was a city of silent laborers whose presence defined the rhythm of every day. The scale of slavery in the capital was staggering. At its peak, Italy itself may have had up to 40% of its population enslaved, and nowhere was this more visible than in Rome. The wealthy elite made slave ownership a public symbol of status. Senators and powerful families kept hundreds, sometimes thousands, of enslaved people in their households. These weren't just cooks or cleaners. There were tutors, scribes, hairdressers, secretaries, and even actors, each one assigned to a specific task, each one essential to the smooth running of a grand Roman home. This culture of ownership trickled down. Middle-class families, too, aspired to keep at least a few slaves. The poet Horace, who considered himself modestly well off, mentioned having 8 slaves on his small country estate. Even shopkeepers, bakers, and craftsmen might own 1 or 2. For many Romans, having someone else to do the dirty work, fetch water, carry goods, run errands, was as normal as owning a tool or a piece of furniture. It was a mark of having made it. The result was a city where enslaved people were everywhere, yet rarely seen for who they were. They swept the floors of temples, tended fires in the public baths, and carried water up endless flights of stairs in the city's crowded insulae, those multi-story apartment blocks where most Romans lived. They worked in bakeries before dawn, loaded carts at the docks, and kept the fountains flowing. For the urban poor, the presence of slaves was both a reminder of their own precarious status and sometimes a distant aspiration. Owning even one slave could be a step up the social ladder. The demand for labor fueled an enormous, relentless trade. Delos, an island in the Aegean, became the Mediterranean's largest slave market. During peak seasons, thousands of captives were sold there daily. Ships arrived packed with people from every corner of the empire, the spoils of war, victims of piracy, and the unlucky caught in debt. Traders moved quickly, inspecting teeth, checking muscles, and asking questions about skills. A strong farmhand might be worth a decent sum, while an educated Greek or a skilled artisan could fetch a price that would take years for a free laborer to earn. Once in Rome, enslaved people were sorted, sold, and scattered across the city. Some were bought in bulk for dangerous work in mines or on farms. Others were hand-picked for their beauty, intelligence, or specific talents. The most expensive slaves were often those who could read and write, or who had specialized skills: doctors, teachers, musicians. But for every prized acquisition, there were thousands destined for backbreaking labor or short, brutal lives in the worst jobs the city had to offer. The city's economy depended on this constant influx of new slaves. They built the aqueducts that brought fresh water, harvested the grain that filled the public granaries, and rowed the ships that supplied the city with food and goods. They maintained the roads, cleaned the sewers, and even entertained the crowds in the arenas. Without their labor, Rome's grand public works and daily comforts would have ground to a halt. But the supply of slaves was not infinite. When Rome's conquest slowed and fewer captives arrived from the frontiers, the system began to strain. Landowners, desperate to keep their estates running, started binding free peasants, colony, to the land, a practice that foreshadowed the rise of medieval serfdom. The city's reliance on enslaved labor had created a system that could not easily adapt when the flow of new people dried up. Where did all these people come from? Most were not born into slavery. They arrived in chains after sudden, life-changing events. Pirates were a constant threat along the Mediterranean coasts, raiding villages and capturing men, women, and children to sell at the markets. The notorious Cilician pirates, operating from what is now southern Turkey, were especially feared. At their height, they commanded over 1,000 ships and enslaved an estimated 300,000 people before the Roman general Pompey finally put an end to their reign in 67 BCE. War was an even bigger source. Roman armies swept across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, and every victory brought new captives. After Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, he reportedly took 53,000 prisoners at Alesia alone, each one destined for a slave market. These mass enslavements were not just about profit. They were a tool of control, a way to break the resistance of conquered peoples and supply Rome's insatiable demand for labor. Debt was another trap. Under Roman law, those who could not pay what they owed could be seized and sold as slaves. This practice was so common that it sometimes sparked riots, as desperate families saw their relatives dragged away. In times of famine, parents might sell their own children, hoping at least they would be fed. Unwanted infants, especially girls, were often abandoned outside the city. Slave traders would collect these foundlings, raise them in special facilities, and sell them when they were old enough to work. Some of the city's most vulnerable residents began their lives this way. The process of turning free people into slaves was efficient and ruthless. At the markets, sellers did everything possible to maximize profits. They dyed hair to hide gray, used makeup to cover bruises, and trained slaves to appear cheerful and obedient. Young women and children were posed to look appealing. Skilled men were advertised for their abilities. Traders knew how to spot troublemakers. Those with rebellious spirits were either broken quickly or sent to the mines, where few survived long. For those who survived the journey and the sale, life in Rome could take many forms. Some found themselves in relative comfort, working in households where they might eventually win freedom. Others faced brutal conditions in fields, quarries, or galleys. The fate of each person depended on the whim of a buyer and the luck of the draw. The presence of so many enslaved people shaped every aspect of Roman life. It influenced how homes were built, how businesses operated, even how the city's laws and customs developed. Yet, despite their numbers and their importance, enslaved people remained largely invisible in the official stories of Rome. The monuments and histories celebrated emperors, generals, and philosophers, but rarely those whose labor made the city possible. Most Romans accepted the system as natural. Few questioned it. For the majority of the city's enslaved population, daily existence was a matter of survival. Their stories were rarely told, their names often forgotten, but their impact on Rome was undeniable. What's striking is that, for many, slavery was not a fate inherited at birth. Instead, it was a sudden, often violent change, a free life lost in an instant. The ways people ended up in bondage were as varied as the city itself. And understanding these paths is key to understanding Rome's story. The many roads to slavery. In Rome, losing your freedom could happen in dozens of ways, some sudden, some slow, and almost all beyond your control. The city's sprawling slave markets didn't just fill with people born into bondage. More often, they filled with those who had started life free, only to be swept up by the empire's relentless appetite for labor. Military conquest was the most dramatic and visible route into slavery. Each Roman victory brought a flood of new captives. When Julius Caesar besieged the Gallic stronghold of Alesia, he reportedly took 53,000 prisoners in a single day, each one destined for the auction block. After the fall of Carthage at the end of the Third Punic War, the remaining 50,000 Carthaginians were marched out and sold as slaves. These mass enslavements weren't just about profit. They were a way to break the will of conquered peoples and remind everyone in Rome just how much power the state could wield. But war was only one source. The Mediterranean was plagued by pirates, especially the infamous Cilician pirates from the coast of what is now southern Turkey. These pirates didn't just attack ships, they raided coastal villages, capturing men, women, and children. They sold entire communities to slave traders. The island of Delos, sitting in the Aegean Sea, became the busiest slave market in the region, with traders processing thousands of captives at a time. It wasn't until Pompey launched a massive campaign against the Cilician pirates in 67 BCE that this particular supply chain was finally disrupted. Life in coastal towns was marked by constant anxiety. People locked their doors at night, but that was often little protection. If pirates raided, families could be torn apart in an instant. Some children ended up in the markets, not through violence, but through abandonment. Foundlings, babies left outside city gates or temples, were routinely collected by slave dealers. Girls were especially vulnerable, since they were often considered less valuable to struggling families. Contracts from the period show that even children as young as 6 could be sold into slavery, their fates decided before they ever had a chance to grow up. Economic hardship created yet another path. Debt slavery was a constant threat for the lower classes. Roman law allowed creditors to seize a debtor and their family members if bills went unpaid. This practice was so disruptive that it sparked riots and forced lawmakers to ban it at times, only for it to return whenever economic crises hit. Desperation sometimes led people to sell themselves voluntarily. One surviving contract from Pompeii records a woman named Acte agreeing to serve a buyer for 5 years in exchange for food and shelter. For many, this was a last-ditch attempt to avoid starvation. The journey from free person to slave was brutal. Captives were marched in chains to holding pens near the coast, where they waited for transport. Slave ships were cramped, filthy, and dangerous. Chained together in dark holds, people endured days or weeks at sea, often with little food or water. Mortality rates on these voyages could reach 20%. Those who survived were brought to quarantine pens near major ports, where dealers began sorting and evaluating them for sale. In Rome, slave markets were a fixture of city life. 2 of the largest stood near the Temple of Castor in the Forum, and the Septa Julia in the Campus Martius. Sellers staged their human wares for maximum profit. Slaves were washed, dressed in clean tunics, and sometimes had their hair dyed to hide grey. Olive oil was rubbed on bruises to make skin look healthier. Dealers trained slaves to smile and answer questions in rehearsed ways. Muscular men were posed with farm tools, while attractive young women were styled to appeal to buyers looking for household servants or concubines. Traders categorized slaves into tiers based on their origins, skills, and appearance. The strongest men were sent to work on farms or in the mines. Educated Greeks often became tutors, scribes, or accountants. Attractive adolescents were marketed as status symbols or companions. There were also specialized slaves, doctors, musicians, cooks, and even miners from Spain, who could identify valuable ore. Prices varied widely. A common laborer might cost 500 sesterces, about 2 months' pay for a Roman soldier. A trained Greek scribe could fetch 4 times that. The most expensive slaves, skilled artisans or strikingly beautiful young women, sold for sums that would bankrupt an average citizen. Buyers inspected slaves as if they were livestock. They checked teeth for age, prodded muscles for strength, and sometimes asked for demonstrations of skill. A Greek tutor might be asked to recite a passage from Homer. A cook could be required to prepare a sample dish. Some dealers offered short-term guarantees, promising a slave's good health for a limited time, though loopholes often favored the seller. Surviving records even include iron slave collars inscribed with return instructions in case a slave tried to escape. Not everyone went quietly. Traders quickly learned to identify rebellious or defiant captives. Some tried to break their spirits through starvation or public beatings. The most troublesome were branded on the forehead with fug for fugitive, or sent straight to the mines. Life expectancy in the mines was measured in weeks. For those who resisted, the system responded with immediate and often deadly force. Once sold, a slave's fate depended entirely on the buyer's needs and whims. Some ended up in the homes of wealthy senators, where they might sleep in decent quarters and eat regular meals, but still face the constant threat of violence or sexual abuse. Others were bought by bakers or craftsmen, condemned to 16-hour days in sweltering workshops. The very unlucky were sent to the mines, where toxic fumes and brutal labor killed quickly. The system produced odd contradictions. Educated Greek slaves taught Roman children philosophy, even as they were legally classified as property. Skilled physicians, themselves slaves, treated noble patients. One famous example is Tiberius Eros, a Greek slave who became tutor to Brutus and Cassius, the very men who would later assassinate Julius Caesar. Despite their talents, these individuals could be punished or even killed at their owner's whim. The origins of Rome's slaves shifted over time. Early on, most came from Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. As Rome's borders expanded, Gauls and Germans became more common in the markets. By the imperial era, slaves arrived from as far away as Britain and North Africa. This constant influx created a hierarchy among slaves themselves. Educated Greeks occupied the top, while unskilled laborers filled the bottom rungs. Everyone in the system lived with the knowledge that tomorrow could bring a beating, a sale, or something worse. There were also legal loopholes that could turn free people into slaves. If a free woman lived with a slave for more than a year, she could become the property of his master. Soldiers who married without official permission risked having their wives enslaved. Even the children of senators could find themselves in chains if a will was improperly witnessed and a relative exploited the loophole. The randomness of enslavement haunted free citizens. A single bad harvest, a pirate raid, or a lost lawsuit could mean the end of freedom. This ever-present threat kept the system in place. Few dared to challenge a world where anyone could fall from citizen to property overnight. But for some, the story didn't end at the auction block. Among the crowds of the newly enslaved, a handful stood out, not for their strength or beauty, but for their knowledge. These were the scholars in chains, whose minds became their most valuable asset in a world that measured people by what they could do for their masters. The scholar in chains, among the many contradictions of Roman society, none stood out more than the role of the scholar in chains. The city's elite clamored for the best education for their children, yet they depended on enslaved intellectuals to provide it. These highly skilled individuals lived at the intersection of privilege and powerlessness, shaping the minds of Rome's future leaders, while being denied even the most basic rights themselves. Greek tutors were especially prized after Rome's conquest of Greece. Educated captives flooded the markets, and their value soared. Greek tutors cost 6,000 to 8,000 sesterces, 3 to 4 times more than a farmhand. For the wealthy, this was a small price to pay for the prestige of having a household philosopher or mathematician. These tutors taught everything from Homer and philosophy to advanced mathematics and rhetoric. Some elite families boasted entire teams of Greek specialists, each one responsible for a different subject. The demand for educated slaves extended far beyond the classroom. Roman households needed physicians, secretaries, accountants, and administrators, roles that required years of training. The philosopher Pliny the Elder depended on his slave secretary Hermes to handle all his correspondence and daily business, a testament to how much Roman intellectual life relied on enslaved expertise. The poet Horace openly credited his slave Davus with helping him compose verses, and it's likely that many other works attributed to famous Romans were, in fact, shaped or even ghost-written by slaves whose names have been lost to history. Despite their enormous influence, these scholars lived under constant threat. Their talents could win them a place at the dinner table, where they recited poetry or debated philosophy with their masters and guests. But a single misstep, an error in teaching, a perceived slight, or simply the whim of an owner, could result in punishment, sale, or separation from everything familiar. Some masters willed their favorite scholar slaves to friends, treating them as prized possessions to be gifted or traded. Even in the best circumstances, their existence was precarious. Educated slaves often dined better than laborers in the fields or workshops and usually escaped the harshest physical labor. Yet, their daily lives were full of tension and uncertainty. One day, they might advise their master on political matters or manage the household's finances. The next, they could be sent away to pay off a debt or because of a change in fortune. Their legal status never changed. They remained property, unable to own land, marry legally, or enter contracts. Some found subtle ways to resist or reclaim a sliver of autonomy. Acts of sabotage, deliberately teaching lessons that encouraged critical thinking or quietly undermining a cruel master, were not unknown. There are accounts of physician slaves giving less effective treatments to abusive owners, or tutors emphasizing the values of Greek democracy over Roman authoritarianism. Such resistance was risky, but it allowed enslaved scholars to assert a measure of control in a system designed to deny them agency. The social dynamics inside Roman households could be bizarre. An educated slave might be entrusted with the family's finances, making decisions that affected everyone in the home, yet still be forced to eat leftovers in the kitchen, separated from the family's table. The philosopher Seneca once described visiting a friend whose trusted slave accountant managed all household accounts, but was still treated as less than human. This disconnect was not lost on the slaves themselves, who navigated a world where their skills were revered but their personhood was denied. For many, the best hope was manumission, the chance to be freed by a grateful master. Some educated slaves did achieve freedom, often continuing to serve as teachers, doctors, or scribes as clients of their former owners. But freedom came with its own complications. Most freedmen remained tied to their ex-masters through networks of patronage, and without Roman citizenship, many struggled to find work outside the household that once owned them. A few, like Gaius Julius Hyginus, who became director of the Palatine Library, or Tiro, who invented a shorthand system after being freed by Cicero, achieved remarkable success. But these were rare exceptions. The majority of educated slaves remained in bondage until death, their contributions unacknowledged. The contradiction at the heart of this system was glaring. Rome's elite depended on enslaved intellects for everything from teaching their children to managing their estates, yet insisted these same people were incapable of citizenship or basic autonomy. Some aristocrats argued for better treatment of educated slaves, not out of compassion, but because it was economically sensible to protect such a valuable asset. A senator might spend a fortune on a Greek accountant, but still believe that person was fundamentally inferior. Educated slaves also faced unique psychological pressures. Unlike field laborers or miners, who often shared their misery with others, scholar slaves were frequently isolated, the only literate person in the household with no peers to confide in. Some developed nervous habits or turned to alcohol to cope with the stress of constantly shifting between the roles of trusted advisor and disposable property. Their lives were a balancing act, requiring them to anticipate the moods and expectations of their masters while suppressing their own ambitions and frustrations. Their impact on Roman society was enormous. Educated slaves introduced Greek literature and philosophy to Roman schools, advanced medical knowledge, and managed the daily affairs of the empire's wealthiest families. The Greek tutor Andronicus is credited with bringing Homer's works into Roman education. Slave physicians treated noble patients and sometimes introduced new treatments to Roman medicine. The spread of Christianity among slaves may have been accelerated by educated servants who recognized the appeal of spiritual equality in a society that denied them basic rights. Yet this influence made them targets. After major slave revolts, Roman authorities grew suspicious of educated slaves, fearing that their knowledge and communication skills could inspire rebellion. Laws were passed to restrict their ability to gather or teach certain subjects, and some households removed books and writing materials from slave quarters after uprisings. The satirist Juvenal even mocked the paranoia of wealthy Romans who feared their Greek tutors might poison them, a reflection of the underlying anxiety about the power of enslaved minds. The tension between dependence and distrust ran through every aspect of the scholar-slave's life. Rome prided itself on culture and learning, but much of that achievement rested on the backs of people who were denied the very freedoms they helped to promote. The city's libraries, schools, and even government offices relied on the work of enslaved intellectuals, yet Roman law offered them no protection. Their talents were exploited for the glory of their masters, and their names were rarely recorded in the history books. For most, the hope of freedom was slim. Surviving records show that while some scholar slaves were eventually manumitted, the majority remained in bondage, their fates dependent on the whims of their owners. Even those who gained their freedom often found themselves economically dependent on former masters, unable to escape the shadow of their past. While the lives of educated slaves were marked by contradiction and uncertainty, they still enjoyed privileges that set them apart from the majority of Rome's enslaved population. Their days were filled with books and conversation, not back-breaking labor. But further down the social ladder, another class of slaves endured a reality so grim that even the scholars' chains seemed light by comparison. Their world was one of darkness and exhaustion, where survival was measured not in years, but in months. 6 months to live if you were sent to the Roman silver mines. Your future was decided the moment you arrived. The phrase 6 months to live wasn't an exaggeration. It was the grim reality for thousands forced underground each year. The mines of Spain, especially, gained a reputation for being places where hope vanished fast. Diodorus Siculus, who witnessed the aftermath, wrote that slaves died by day and night, and that death often seemed preferable to the life they endured below ground. Imagine crawling through tunnels so narrow you had to drag yourself on your belly, hundreds of feet beneath the earth. The only light came from smoky torches, their fumes mixing with metallic dust that clung to every breath. The air was thick, stale, and poisoned by the very minerals workers were forced to extract. The further you went, the hotter it got, until sweat ran in rivers and breathing turned into a struggle. There was no pause in this world. Work continued around the clock. Slaves formed human chains, passing heavy sacks of silver ore up rickety ladders. Some tunnels were so low that miners had to chip away at the ceiling while lying flat on their backs, stone dust falling into their mouths and eyes. Collapses happened all the time. If a tunnel caved in, the overseers didn't dig out the trapped. They just sent in replacements and moved on. Archaeologists have found skeletons clutching their tools, crushed where they worked, evidence of lives ended mid-task. But the most insidious killer wasn't falling rock or suffocating dust. It was mercury. Romans used mercury to separate silver from ore, a process that required stirring vats of toxic sludge by hand. Slaves inhaled the fumes and absorbed the poison through their skin. Over time, mercury built up in their bodies, causing tremors, hallucinations, and organ failure. Many lost their grip on reality before their bodies finally gave out. Excavations in Spain have uncovered skeletons with mercury contamination far beyond normal levels, a silent record of exposure that outlasted the empire itself. There was no rest, no sick days, and no mercy. Overseers drove the workers relentlessly, whips in hand, expecting everyone to keep pace or be discarded. The health of the enslaved was never a priority. What mattered was the rate of silver extracted. If someone slowed down, they were left behind. Mass graves near ancient mines are filled with skeletons showing old fractures and injuries, proof that many worked through pain until they simply couldn't anymore. Restraints didn't end with the living. In one Spanish mine, archaeologists found skeletons still locked in iron collars, the metal fused to bone. These people died in chains, forced to keep working even when illness or injury made it impossible to stand. One set of remains belonged to a teenager whose spine was permanently damaged from carrying overloaded baskets up ladders. His vertebrae were compressed like those of an elderly man, even though he probably hadn't survived more than a few months in the mine. The scale was staggering. Some mines burned through tens of thousands of slaves every year just to keep up with demand. That meant more than 100 deaths a day across the empire's mining regions. Spanish silver didn't just pay for Rome's armies and monuments. It was the backbone of the entire economy. Every coin minted in Rome had passed through the hands of these workers, yet not a single one bore their name. Why did the system tolerate such waste? The answer was cold economics. New slaves from military campaigns or pirate raids were cheaper than caring for those already in the mines. A captive bought for a modest sum could extract many times their purchase price in silver before dying. Providing better food, medical care, or safer working conditions would have cut into profits. Mine owners calculated exactly how little they could spend to keep output high, treating people as disposable resources. Surviving wills from mine owners reveal this mindset. One owner advised his heirs to work the slaves hard, but avoid buying weak Easterners who died too quickly. Another left instructions on how to use the whip to maximize productivity without causing immediate collapse. This wasn't about cruelty for its own sake. It was the logic of Roman business, where efficiency always came first. To keep the workforce under control, overseers combined threats with occasional rewards. New arrivals were sometimes forced to witness harsh punishments, a warning of what could happen if they disobeyed. At other times, the most productive workers received extra food or small privileges, turning the enslaved against each other. Rumors circulated that good behavior might bring freedom, but in reality, almost no one ever escaped the mines alive. The worst jobs went to those who resisted or broke the rules. Troublemakers were sent to the deepest, hottest tunnels where temperatures soared and air was scarce. Some were chained to millstones, grinding ore for hours until their hands became twisted and deformed. Archaeologists have found skeletons with enlarged wrists and arthritic fingers, signs of endless, repetitive labor. Chronic dehydration was common. Some workers chewed rocks to suck out the last traces of moisture, wearing their teeth down to stubs. Children were not spared. Their small bodies could squeeze into spaces adults couldn't reach, making them valuable but especially vulnerable. In Spanish mines, graves have revealed skeletons of children as young as 8, their bones stunted and misshapen from years of carrying heavy loads. Skulls show multiple healed fractures, likely from beatings. Few children survived more than a year in the mines. Diodorus observed that slaves died in large numbers, yet the mines were never short of workers. When one group perished, traders delivered another. The historian even noted that some slaves welcomed death, seeing it as a release from suffering. There are accounts of people provoking their overseers, hoping for a beating severe enough to end their misery quickly, rather than waiting for poison or exhaustion to take its toll. Still, the system wasn't perfect. There were moments of resistance. In one uprising, Spanish slaves overpowered their guards with mining tools, briefly taking control of the site before being crushed by Roman soldiers. More often, resistance was subtle, sabotaging equipment, mislabeling ore, or passing warnings to new arrivals about the most brutal overseers. These small acts were dangerous, but they allowed workers to reclaim a bit of dignity in a world designed to strip it away. The indifference of Rome's elite was striking. Senators and merchants enjoyed the wealth that silver brought, rarely considering its source. The poet Martial once joked about Spanish silver being washed in barbarian sweat, a line that captured the casual disregard for the lives fueling the empire's luxury. When a governor tried to improve mine conditions, he was quickly removed for interfering with profits. The mines operated for centuries, leaving scars not just on the landscape, but in the stories of those who passed through them. Today, the soil around ancient Spanish mines still contains dangerous levels of mercury, a toxic legacy of Rome's relentless pursuit of wealth. Later visitors, centuries after the empire fell, found bones blackened and twisted, silent witnesses to lives spent in darkness. These mines were not just places of labor, they were sites of relentless exploitation, where human beings were reduced to numbers in an endless calculation of profit. The silver that glittered in Rome's temples and coinage came at a cost few cared to acknowledge. Every ounce was paid for with human suffering, every fortune built on the backs of those who never saw daylight again. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming odds, enslaved people found ways to push back. When open rebellion was impossible, they turned to quieter forms of resistance. Some risked everything for a chance at freedom, despite the dangers that awaited those who tried to escape. For many, the hope of slipping away, of making it past the guards and into the world beyond, became the last spark that kept them moving, even as Rome did everything it could to keep them in chains. The collar that spoke for enslaved people in Rome, even the faintest hope of escape came with a heavy price, sometimes literally. The city's answer to runaway slaves was as practical as it was cruel, the collar that spoke for its wearer. These metal bands, often made of iron or bronze, weren't just restraints. They were public announcements, designed to turn the person wearing one into a walking notice board. Roman slave collars were permanently fastened around the neck, with some weighing more than 2 pounds. Their real power lay in the words stamped or engraved into the metal. The inscriptions acted as instructions to anyone who might encounter the runaway. One collar, now in the British Museum, reads, "Hold me and return me to my master Viventius." Others gave even more details, identifying the slave's name, the master's name, and the location where the slave should be returned. One surviving example states, "I am Marcellus, slave of Praetectus, who is an official in the Department of the Grain Supply. I have escaped from my post. Detain me, for I have run away. Take me back to the barber's shops near the Temple of Flora." Imagine having your status and your owner's instructions displayed for everyone to see, every moment of your life. The collar's psychological impact was as significant as their physical discomfort. To wear one was to carry a constant reminder of your status, and to know that everyone you passed could read your story. Some collars even mentioned rewards for return, paid out by the master to anyone who brought a runaway back. The message was clear. The city itself was enlisted in policing the enslaved, and every citizen became a potential informant or captor. Slave owners didn't rely solely on these collars. They had professional help. The fugitivarii, professional slave catchers, roamed the streets, countryside, and ports, working on commission. These bounty hunters specialized in tracking down runaways, using their knowledge of slave routes, hiding places, and the habits of those desperate enough to risk escape. They kept lists and descriptions, sometimes noting distinguishing marks, accents, or habits. Their job was to bring back as many fugitives as possible for a fee. The law supported their work at every turn. Roman legal codes included entire sections devoted to the procedures for recapturing runaway slaves. If you found a slave, you were legally required to return them. Refusing to do so could result in fines equal to the slave's value. Special courts settled disputes over ownership, and there were rules about how to advertise a found slave before claiming them as your own. The legal system made it clear. The rights of slave owners were paramount, and the machinery of the state existed to protect their property. For runaways, daily life was a minefield. Public spaces were filled with notices offering rewards for the return of escaped slaves. These ads included detailed descriptions. Greek male, about 30, missing front tooth, burn scar on left arm. Owners often listed unique habits or speech patterns, such as stutters when nervous or sings while working. Any personal trait could be used as an identifier. The city's baths, markets, and taverns became places of risk. Anyone could recognize you, and anyone could turn you in. Wealthier households took even more precautions. Some kept trained dogs that could identify slaves by scent. Others imposed constant surveillance, with rotating shifts to ensure that slaves watched each other. There were even systems where the failure of one slave to prevent another's escape resulted in punishment for both. The pressure to stay put was relentless and came from all directions. The design of the collars themselves changed over time. Early versions were plain metal bands. Later, they became more elaborate, sometimes including extra loops for chaining groups together. Archaeologists have found skeletons still wearing these collars centuries later. The metal fused to bone, a stark reminder of how permanent this mark of enslavement could be. The measures seem extreme, but they were a response to a real problem. Escape attempts were common enough that notices for recapture appeared everywhere. Professional slave catchers kept busy, and the possibility of escape was always on the minds of both slaves and their owners. The fact that so much effort went into preventing and reversing escapes shows just how persistent the desire for freedom was. Some enslaved people became experts in disguise and deception. They learned enough Latin to pass as free citizens or forged documents declaring their freedom. Others tried to blend in by adopting new identities, posing as sailors, merchants, or laborers. There are stories of women pretending to be pregnant to avoid harsh punishment, since Roman law forbade executing pregnant slaves. Some even went so far as to scar their own faces, making themselves harder to recognize and less valuable if caught. The risks, however, were enormous. If caught, runaways faced a strict hierarchy of punishments. First-time offenders might receive a whipping or be forced to wear heavier chains. Repeat attempts could lead to branding, often on the face or forehead, with marks that identified them as fugitives. Some were tattooed with warnings like, "Stop me, I'm a runaway." In the most severe cases, especially for those considered incorrigible, the punishment could be crucifixion. The system was designed to deter escape, but also to avoid destroying valuable property when possible. Skilled slaves might be punished in ways that kept them working, such as being shackled or reassigned to unpleasant duties. Not all collars threatened violence. Some simply offered instructions or rewards. "I am the slave of Felix the Archdeacon. If I flee, return me to the Lateran Palace." Whether this reflected a gentler approach or simply a different strategy is up for debate. Some historians suggest Christian owners may have used guilt or social pressure as much as force. But the message remained unchanged. The person wearing the collar was not free. Fugitivari developed their own tactics, lurking near temples where runaways might seek sanctuary, watching the roads leading out of the city, or posing as travelers in need of help. Sometimes they even tricked runaways by pretending to offer protection, only to turn them in for a reward. The entire system was stacked against those who tried to break free. Legal loopholes sometimes offered a glimmer of hope. In certain cities, a slave who managed to live undetected for a year could claim limited freedom, but the protection ended if they left city limits. Masters exploited these rules, sending agents to lure runaways just beyond the boundary, where recapture became legal again. The process was a constant game of cat and mouse, with the odds always favoring the pursuers. The physical collars themselves have become silent witnesses to this history. Some bear inscriptions in both Latin and local languages, hinting at the diverse origins of those enslaved after conquests. Others show signs of alteration, where previous owners' names were scratched out and replaced. The metal carries the scars of lives spent in fear and uncertainty, long after the people themselves are gone. Public attitudes toward runaways varied. Some citizens eagerly turned in fugitives for the reward, while others quietly offered food or directions. Graffiti from Pompeii reveals this split. Some images praise slave catchers as heroes, while others mock them as fools. The economic cost of escape was real. Owners lost labor, paid rewards, and sometimes hired professional catchers. Manuals advise careful accounting to minimize these losses, treating slaves as assets to be managed. Despite all these barriers, people still ran. The persistence of escape attempts speaks volumes about the conditions of Roman slavery. Every new shackle, every law, every public punishment was a sign that the system could not fully extinguish the human drive for freedom. Today, the collars remain. Their inscriptions faded but still legible after 2,000 years. They outlasted the people who wore them, the masters who ordered them, and the empire that depended on their message. Yet the system of control, for all its ingenuity and brutality, could not contain the most explosive threat of all. Sometimes, resistance did not come in the form of a lone escape. Sometimes, it erupted into open revolt, and when that happened, even the might of Rome was put to the test. Spartacus's shadow. When people today think of slave resistance in ancient Rome, one name towers above the rest: Spartacus. His story didn't begin with a grand declaration or a mass uprising, but with a small group of gladiators, about 78 men, according to ancient sources, breaking out of a training school in Capua. Spartacus, a Thracian who had once served in the Roman army before being enslaved, was among them. What started as a desperate escape quickly caught fire. Word spread, and soon, slaves from the countryside and the cities alike began slipping away to join the rebels. According to some ancient estimates, Spartacus eventually amassed up to 120,000 followers, a number that rivaled the size of Roman legions, though most historians agree the actual count was likely lower. Still, the force grew large enough to shake the entire Roman Republic. The reasons behind this swelling army were rooted in the daily misery of Roman slavery. Spartacus and his companions weren't just fighting for their own freedom. They tapped into a deep well of frustration and longing among Rome's enslaved and impoverished people. The rebels offered a vision, however rough, of life outside bondage. That hope and the promise of turning the tables on their masters drew thousands to their side. Some came from rural estates, others from city workshops. There were farmhands, miners, cooks, and even people who had once served as soldiers. This wasn't just a mob. It became a functioning army, organized with surprising discipline and fueled by a powerful sense of purpose. The Senate, at first, didn't take the threat seriously. Rome had seen slave revolts before. None had ever lasted long. They sent inexperienced commanders with small forces, thinking a handful of soldiers could put down the rebellion. But Spartacus's group proved different. They seized weapons and armor from their first victories, training themselves in Roman tactics. They learned to fight as a unit, set up supply lines, and even forged their own weapons. After each defeat, the rebels grew stronger, their confidence building with every Roman retreat. One of the most striking moments came as the rebel army moved through southern Italy. They passed stretches of the Via Appia, the great road lined with the remains of rebels from earlier uprisings, grim reminders of Rome's usual response to defiance. Spartacus's forces turned this terror tactic back on Rome, crucifying captured Roman soldiers along the same route. It was a message, both to the Senate and to every enslaved person watching from the fields. the balance of power could shift. As the revolt dragged on, panic crept into the Roman elite. Wealthy Romans, seeing the crosses along the roads, grew anxious about conspiracies and the possibility that their own slaves might rise up. Reports of entire estates emptying overnight sent shivers through the countryside. The fear wasn't just about violence, it was about the realization that the enslaved, if united, could threaten the very foundations of Roman society. Seneca later wrote that the Senate considered measures to make slaves more easily identifiable, such as requiring distinctive clothing, but abandoned the idea out of fear that it would reveal to slaves just how many of them there were compared to their masters. The Senate's response escalated. They mobilized 8 legions, a force larger than what had been sent against some of Rome's greatest external enemies. The general Marcus Licinius Crassus took command and imposed harsh discipline on his own troops, including decimation, executing every 10th man in units that faltered. Spartacus's army, meanwhile, continued to outmaneuver Roman forces. They built fortifications, used psychological tricks like propping up corpses in armor to inflate their apparent numbers, and moved with a speed and adaptability that caught Roman commanders off guard. The rebels even tried to cross to Sicily, seeking to spark more uprisings, though this plan ultimately failed. For nearly 2 years, from 73 to 71 BC, Spartacus and his followers held out. They won battles, evaded capture, and kept the Roman military machine on its heels. The rebels were not just surviving, they were winning, at least for a time. Their tactics, including psychological warfare, resourceful use of terrain, and the ability to train and equip new recruits, revealed a level of organization that many Romans had not believed possible among slaves. But the tide eventually turned. Crassus, reinforced by legions recalled from other provinces, managed to trap the rebels in southern Italy. The final battle was brutal. Spartacus was killed, his body never found, and the rebellion collapsed. The aftermath was as harsh as the revolt itself. According to Plutarch and later sources, over 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Via Appia, the road from Capua to Rome. For miles, the sight of bodies hanging from crosses served as a chilling warning to anyone who might consider following in Spartacus's footsteps. The shockwaves from the revolt lasted long after the last cross had fallen. The Senate debated drastic new controls, including proposals to ban slave gatherings of more than 3 people, and to restrict the use of certain languages, such as Gallic or Thracian, in group settings. These measures aimed to disrupt communication and prevent future conspiracies. Slave traders and wealthy Romans began to prefer enslaved people from different regions, hoping language barriers would keep them from organizing. The legal system adapted, always with an eye toward preventing another uprising on the scale of Spartacus's. The psychological impact was profound. The revolt had exposed the weaknesses of the Roman system. It showed that enslaved people could organize, plan, and fight with skill and determination. It also revealed the deep anxieties of the ruling class. The philosopher Seneca described how the Senate, after the revolt, rejected a proposal to kill all slaves in Italy, not out of mercy, but because the economy depended on their labor. Rome, in other words, could not exist without slavery, but it also could not feel safe with so many enslaved people in its midst. Traces of Spartacus's influence lingered in Roman culture. Graffiti in places like Pompeii praised his name years after the revolt. Gladiators sometimes invoked Spartacus before entering the arena, turning his memory into a symbol of resistance and hope. Literature, plays, and later, Modern films and television would immortalize his struggle, often casting him as a hero fighting for freedom against impossible odds. Yet the reality of the revolt was more complicated than legend. Spartacus's army inflicted violence as well as suffering, and the chaos of the war brought hardship to many. Still, the fact that a group of enslaved people and the poor could challenge the might of Rome for 2 years forced everyone, from senators to farmers, to reconsider what was possible. The revolt did not end slavery, but it shattered the illusion that control was absolute. In the countryside, unease lingered. There were stories of missing tools, animals found loose, and mysterious crop failures. No one could prove sabotage, but suspicion hung in the air. The fear of another revolt shaped how Romans treated their slaves, how they wrote their laws, and how they watched for signs of unrest. The crosses along the Via Appia faded, but the memory of Spartacus's shadow never left the empire. Despite the scale and drama of open revolt, most enslaved people in Rome had no realistic chance of fighting in the open. Their resistance took other forms, quieter, more careful, but no less determined. The next chapter of Roman slavery wasn't written in blood on the battlefield, but in the small acts of defiance that slipped beneath the notice of masters. Because when rebellion in the streets was impossible, resistance found new ways to survive. 9. The price of freedom. Gaining freedom in ancient Rome meant stepping into a world of new rules, expectations, and limitations. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, could take several forms, each one carefully regulated by Roman law. A master might grant freedom in a formal ceremony before a magistrate, known as manumissio vindicta, using a symbolic rod to touch the slave's shoulder. Sometimes, a slave was freed by being entered on the census rolls, manumissio censu, or through a will, manumissio testamento, with a change in status becoming official only after the master's death. However it happened, the newly freed person received a certificate of freedom and wore a felt cap called the pileus, marking their new position in society, but the reality of freedom was far more complicated than the ceremony suggested. Freedmen and freedwomen, former slaves who had been granted liberty, entered a social category all their own. They gained Roman citizenship, which meant the right to marry, own property, and conduct business. Yet the law drew a firm line. Freedmen could not hold major public offices or serve in the military. Their children, born after manumission, would be full citizens with no legal disabilities, but the freedmen themselves carried a lasting social stigma. Many Roman writers and poets took aim at freedmen, mocking their speech, their manners, and their attempts to climb the social ladder. The ties to former masters didn't vanish with freedom. Instead, they shifted into a new, legally binding relationship called patronage. The ex-master became the patron, and the freedman or freedwoman became the client. This wasn't just a friendly arrangement. It was a system of daily obligations. Freedmen were expected to visit their patrons each morning, offer greetings, and help with errands, business deals, or political campaigns. In return, patrons provided protection, financial help, and introductions to useful contacts. The arrangement could be mutually beneficial, but it often left freedmen dependent on their patrons for work and social advancement. Some even continued to live in their former master's house, only now as clients instead of property. Economic life for freedmen varied widely. In Rome's bustling cities, many found opportunities in trades, crafts, and small businesses. Some became bakers, barbers, butchers, or potters, building shops and workshops with skills learned in slavery. The tomb of Eurysaces, a former slave who became a successful baker, still stands outside Rome's ancient walls. Its elaborate carvings show him supervising workers, some of whom were slaves themselves. For a few, business success brought real wealth, but even the richest freedmen were often viewed with suspicion by Rome's old families. The satirical novelist Petronius created Trimalchio, a comic freedman whose vulgar displays of wealth made him a target for ridicule, a reminder that money could not buy social acceptance. In the countryside, freedmen faced different challenges. Many became tenant farmers, leasing land from their former masters. The terms were rarely generous. Some contracts required up to half the harvest as rent, and a bad season could plunge a freedman back into debt. Archaeologists have found rural graves where freedmen were buried with both their freedom cap and farming tools, symbols of liberty mixed with reminders of hard labor. Imperial freedmen occupied a unique position. The emperor's household was staffed by highly educated slaves and freedmen, some of whom rose to positions of astonishing influence. A freedman like Narcissus, who handled imperial correspondence for Emperor Claudius, could control the flow of information to the most powerful man in the empire. Others, like Pallas, managed the treasury or oversaw vast estates. Their power sometimes provoked resentment among senators, who had to petition these upstarts for favors. Laws were even passed to limit their influence, but the imperial freedmen's proximity to the emperor kept them at the heart of Roman politics. Legal restrictions on freedmen were never far from the surface. If a freedman became wealthy, the former patron could sue for a share, arguing that the freedman's success was built on the patron's support. Roman law sometimes required freedmen to leave a portion of their estate to their patron, even after death. The system ensured that, even in freedom, obligations to the former master lingered. In one court case, a freedman physician was forced to hand over half his earnings to his ex-master. The leash of dependency could stretch for a lifetime. Women who gained freedom faced extra hurdles. A slave woman could be freed by marrying her master, and her children would be born free citizens. But these marriages were rarely equal. Freed women had fewer rights than freeborn wives, and their husbands could divorce them easily, often keeping any property the woman brought into the marriage. The funerary relief of Antistia Plutia, now in the British Museum, shows a freedwoman who married her former master and went on to own slaves and freedmen herself. Still, her memorial identifies her first as a freedwoman, then as a wife, a subtle reminder of the hierarchy that persisted even in death. The motivations for manumission were complex. Some masters freed slaves as a reward for loyalty or years of service. Others did so for practical reasons. Elderly slaves might be freed to avoid the cost of care, or a merchant might free a trusted slave to act as a legal representative in business dealings. Not all manumissions were acts of kindness. Some were calculated moves to shift responsibility or create new forms of obligation. The law even allowed masters to free slaves in their wills, but Augustus limited how many could be freed this way, worried that too many manumissions would drain the labor supply. Religion offered a partial escape from the social hierarchy. Some freedmen joined the cults of Cybele or Isis, where status mattered less than devotion. Inscriptions show that wealthy freedmen sometimes paid for temple renovations or sponsored religious festivals, using their resources to gain respect in these communities. Yet even here, the old patterns persisted. Temple seating and honors often reflected wealth and connections, not just piety. The journey to true freedom was rarely smooth. Freedmen's children, born after manumission, enjoyed full citizenship and could rise in society. By the 2nd century AD, many mid-level officials and tradespeople were the grandchildren of slaves. This slow integration changed Rome from within. But for the first generation, daily life often meant enduring slights, being passed over for public honors, mocked for accents, or required to yield the sidewalk to free-born Romans. Not every freedman struggled. Some managed to turn the tables. The banker Passion, once a slave in Athens, became so wealthy that his former master borrowed money from him. In Rome, Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, a freedman, reportedly left 4,000 slaves in his will. Yet these stories were rare. Most freedmen found that freedom came with new burdens, not just new rights. Tomb inscriptions offer a window into freedmen's lives. Many highlight their professions: Titus the builder or Eurysaces the baker, rather than their freed status. Some list patrons' names, a nod to the ongoing relationship that shaped their lives. Others reveal the limits of liberation: couples who buried children still listed as slaves, or inscriptions that stress loyalty and gratitude to former masters. Imperial freedmen's tombs add another layer. Even at the height of power, their epitaphs often include phrases like, "He never forgot his station," or "He knew when to step aside for freeborn men." The internalized hierarchy remained, no matter how much wealth or influence a freedman gained. As Rome's expansion slowed, the system began to strain. Fewer new slaves meant fewer opportunities for manumission. Freedmen's children, born free, sought better lives and avoided the backbreaking labor their parents had endured. The patronage networks that once kept freedmen in check started to fray. Legal battles broke out as patrons accused each other of stealing loyal clients. Some freedmen played patrons against each other, bargaining for better terms, a small but significant shift in the balance of power. The military, while closed to freedmen themselves, became a path to advancement for their sons. Many rose through the ranks, and by the 3rd century AD, men of slave ancestry could be found in the highest offices, even on the imperial throne. The system designed to keep freedmen at the margins wound up producing some of Rome's most ambitious leaders. Christianity complicated the picture. Its message of spiritual equality appealed to many freedmen, but church leaders still urged obedience to patrons. Sermons encouraged freedmen to serve willingly as you once did unwillingly, showing that even new faiths could struggle to break old habits. The eastern provinces of the empire handled integration differently. Greek cities often granted full citizenship to the children of freedmen after a single generation. In Constantinople, elite families with slave ancestry quietly blended into the upper classes. This flexibility helped the Eastern Empire outlast Rome's western half by centuries. Through it all, the price of freedom in Rome was always high. Liberty brought new rights, but also new forms of dependence and social exclusion. Freedmen navigated a maze of obligations, legal traps, and prejudice, carving out space for themselves and their families in a society that never fully accepted them. Their story is a reminder that freedom, in any age, is rarely free, and that the legacy of slavery lingers long after the chains are gone. But even as freedmen found ways to adapt and advance, the foundations of Rome's social order remained deeply unstable. The anxieties of the elite simmered just beneath the surface, fed by memories of revolt and the ever-present knowledge of how many people lived at the empire's margins. 10. The senator's nightmare. For the senators and wealthy citizens of Rome, comfort came with a constant sense of unease. The philosopher Seneca once asked what might happen if Rome's enslaved people realized just how many of them there were, an unsettling thought, given that scholars estimate as much as 10 to 20% of the empire's population lived in bondage. This wasn't just idle speculation. The elite understood their world rested on the backs of millions who had every reason to resent it. After the shock of major revolts, the Senate responded with new rules designed to keep the enslaved divided and powerless. Following the uprising of Spartacus, authorities banned slaves from gathering in groups larger than 3. In some regions, they even restricted which languages could be spoken among slaves, hoping to prevent secret plotting. These measures weren't just about order, they were about fear. The elite knew that unity among the enslaved would spell disaster for their way of life. Inside grand villas and city homes, this fear shaped daily routines. Some masters scattered informants among their household staff, rewarding those who reported rumors or suspicious conversations. Others rotated enslaved workers between farms or city districts, making it harder for close friendships or alliances to form. The agricultural writer Columella advised landowners to keep slaves from the same region apart, so that language and custom wouldn't give rise to solidarity. These were practical steps, but they revealed a deeper anxiety. The constant worry that rebellion could start anywhere, at any time. The threat was real. Besides the famous revolt led by Spartacus, at least 2 major uprisings had already shaken Sicily, with enslaved farm workers turning plantations into strongholds. Slave resistance was not rare or isolated. It was a recurring part of Roman life. Some revolts lasted months or even years, forcing the state to send armies and spend fortunes to restore control. Each time, the authorities responded with a mix of brutal punishment and new regulations. After putting down a rebellion, they might execute thousands by crucifixion, then issue orders to improve food and clothing for slaves, not out of compassion, but to reduce the risk of future unrest. The numbers were always on the mind of the elite. In cities like Rome, nearly half the population could be enslaved at times. Every street, market, and household was a potential flashpoint. Seneca noted that even talking openly about the sheer number of slaves was dangerous. It could make the enslaved realize their collective power. The Senate once considered requiring slaves to wear distinctive clothing, but quickly abandoned the idea. They feared that such a move would reveal just how outnumbered the free citizens actually were. Paranoia seeped into every corner of elite life. Some masters tasted their food only after a slave had tried it first, worried about poison. Others slept in different rooms each night, or surrounded themselves with armed guards. The poet Juvenal mocked a senator who installed a rotating bed to keep all doors in view, a symbol of the elaborate precautions the wealthy took. These routines weren't just eccentricities, they were daily reminders of the ever-present threat. Even within the enslaved population, divisions were encouraged. House slaves looked down on those who worked the fields, while urban slaves felt superior to their rural counterparts. Educated Greek tutors often saw themselves as above manual laborers. Masters exploited these differences, knowing that a divided population was less likely to unite in resistance. One inscription even boasts of a slave manager who betrayed his own brother's escape plan, hoping to earn favor with his master. Religion added another layer of anxiety. Authorities sometimes banned foreign cults among slaves, suspecting that religious gatherings could be used as cover for conspiracy. The rise of Christianity, with its message of spiritual equality, unsettled many elites. Officials often linked Christian meetings with the threat of rebellion, fueling suspicion and crackdowns. The military, too, reflected these fears. Most legionaries came from the freeborn poor, who already felt threatened by competition from slave labor. Officers discouraged soldiers from befriending slaves, worried that shared frustrations could lead to trouble. After Spartacus's defeat, even victorious troops questioned why they had fought so hard to protect a system that also oppressed free workers. Despite all these precautions, the basic structure of Roman society made real reform almost impossible. The economy depended on slave labor, not just in the fields and mines, but as a symbol of status. Middle-class Romans aspired to own at least one slave. The wealthiest measured their fortunes by the number of people they controlled, with inventories listing field hands, household staff, and entertainers alongside livestock and furniture. Free workers, facing competition from unpaid labor, rarely supported abolition. The entire system ran on a constant supply of new slaves. Expansion through conquest brought a steady stream of captives. When Rome's borders stopped growing, the supply dwindled and prices soared. Some landowners began raising the children of slaves to keep up with demand, treating people as a renewable resource. Attempts at regulation often missed the mark. Nero passed laws allowing abused slaves to appeal to magistrates, but very few dared to take the risk. Claudius forbade masters from killing sick slaves without cause, but many simply abandoned the ill to die. Hadrian banned arbitrary executions, but enforcement was weak, especially outside the city. The psychological cost of this system was visible in art and daily life. Roman mosaics and paintings often show serene families at the center, with slaves standing at the edges, present but anonymous. Graffiti in Pompeii mixes advertisements for slave sales with warnings to would-be runaways. The legal code itself struggled to reconcile the idea of slaves as property with the reality that they could think, feel, and plot. This contradiction ran through every level of Roman society. The structure of slavery even shaped the world of the enslaved. Roles and hierarchies developed. Some slaves managed others, while many worked hard to gain the trust of their masters in hopes of better treatment or eventual freedom. Masters sometimes promoted rivalry and suspicion among their slaves, rewarding those who reported on their peers. These tactics kept the enslaved population divided, but they also fostered resentment and instability. As Rome's expansion slowed, the cracks in the system became harder to ignore. With fewer new slaves arriving, some owners treated their labor force slightly better, hoping to avoid rebellion. Others began to prefer freedmen for sensitive positions, thinking that gratitude would guarantee loyalty, but this sometimes backfired. As freedmen like the imperial secretary Pallas gained influence and provoked jealousy among senators, the Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, relied less on mass enslavement and blended paid labor with slavery, creating a more flexible system that weathered change better than Rome's rigid structure. Slavery's grip on Rome was so tight that even as the system started to falter, the elite found themselves trapped. Dependence on forced labor brought wealth and status, but also constant anxiety and the threat of collapse. The laws and routines designed to keep slaves under control only highlighted the underlying instability. The result was a society always on edge, unable to imagine a future without the very institution that threatened its survival. In the end, the senator's nightmare wasn't just the fear of open revolt. It was the realization that their own prosperity was built on a fragile foundation. The system that enriched them also made them vulnerable, and as Rome's ability to expand faded, so did the illusion of control. The real danger lay not in the slaves themselves, but in the contradictions woven into every part of Roman life. As we look back on Rome's legacy, it's easy to be dazzled by its monuments and achievements. But beneath the surface, the empire's story is also one of hidden costs and uneasy bargains. Reminders that greatness often comes at a price not easily seen in stone or marble. 11. Conclusion. Every wonder of Rome, its columns, aqueducts, and grand arenas, was shaped by hands that rarely saw recognition. For every poem penned by a Roman philosopher, a slave cleaned the ink from his robes. Many perished in the mines so that the city's spectacles could go on. Rome's splendor rested on the efforts of people whose stories were often left untold. As you think back to that opening moment, waking up not as a senator, but as one of the millions in chains, ask yourself, what really underlies an empire's greatness? The legacy isn't just in the ruins, but in the lives woven into every stone. What do you think Rome's true legacy should be? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this look behind the marble, subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden story.